It's scary to think how normal a completely deranged individual can appear.
Friendly, gregarious, outgoing.
But much like the case of Ted Bundy or Israel Keyes, this was nothing more than another tool used to lure victims in.
Some serial killers, they need to put on a normal face to interact with members of society and have access to victims.
However, when this thin veil is peeled away, police came to find out.
He was calculated, cold-blooded killer.
He was so calculated in his approach that there were some who thought he may have been the notorious Zodiac killer.
Been into crime.
He exhibited all of the classic signs of, the stereotypical signs of a serial killer. He was a bedwetter. He had an affinity for starting fires. He was extremely controlling.
Let's dive into the twisted life of Edward Wayne Edwards. Edward Wayne Edwards, born Charles Murray on June 14, 1933, entered the world under circumstances already marked by instability and tragedy. He was born in Ohio to a single mother, Lillian Cecilia Myers. Lillian's struggle as a young unwed mother was compounded by her arrest and conviction for theft when Edwards was just a year old. Her crime, the theft of $100 from the family she worked for as a housekeeper. The arrest led to a 14-month prison sentence, during which time Edwards was placed in the care of his aunt and uncle. The early years of Edwards' life were characterized by constant upheaval. After his mother's release from prison, Lillian faced a series of personal challenges, culminating in her tragic suicide in 1938 when Edwards was only 5 years old. The cause of her death, a self-inflicted gunshot wound, reportedly came after the rough end of a romantic relationship. This event would become a critical turning point in Edwards' life, leaving him an orphan and sealing his fate as a child raised without a stable, nurturing environment. Following his mother's death, Edwards was formally adopted by his aunt, Mary Ethel Myers, and her husband, Fred Edwards. His name was changed to Edward Wayne Edwards. Though Edwards later described his relationship with his adoptive mother as loving, their household was far from idyllic. By the time Edwards was 7 years old, Mary became bedridden with multiple sclerosis, and Fred developed a chronic drinking problem. In 1940, when Mary's illness worsened, Edwards was sent to an orphanage in Parma, Ohio. The orphanage, which should have provided some semblance of structure, instead became a source of further trauma for Edwards. He later claimed that during his time there, he was subjected to relentless abuse, both physical and emotional, from the staff and other boys under their care. The orphanage, which should have served as a place for protection, instead reinforced his growing sense of anger, rejection, and resentment towards the world. It was at the orphanage that Edwards' future criminal path began to take shape. By the age of 11, Edwards has already developed a deep-seated disdain for authority and society. When asked by a nun what he wanted to be when he grew up, Edwards chillingly replied, "I'm going to be a crook, and I'm going to be a good one." This statement, coming from a boy not even in his teenage years, reveals the extent to which Edwards had already internalized his identity as an outsider, a person who would live outside of societal norms. At 12, Edwards was sent back to live with his adoptive parents, though their home life remained chaotic. His adoptive mother's death later that year left Edwards without any meaningful parental guidance, and he began to engage in petty criminal behavior. He started stealing bicycles and concocting schemes to collect money under false pretenses, such as claiming he was raising funds for families who had just lost loved ones. This early pattern of deception and theft was driven less by financial need and more by craving for attention. Edwards admitted that the thrill of seeing the chaos he caused, whether by setting fires or calling in false alarms, was what truly motivated him. These acts were just his way of being noticed, of asserting his presence in a world that had largely ignored him. By the age of 14, Edward's criminal behavior had escalated, landing him in a reform school in Philadelphia, where he stayed for over a year. While there, he claimed he was once again subjected to abuse, an experience that further hardened him. After his release, Edwards briefly attempted to straighten out his life by joining the US Marines at the age of 17. However, even the structure of military life could not keep Edwards on the straight and narrow path for long. Disappointed when he was not allowed to deploy to Korea, he went to AWOL, using his Marine uniform to defraud people and cash forged checks. After going AWOL from the US Marines in 1951, Edwards quickly embraced his life of crime. Donning his Marine uniform, he used it as a tool for defrauding people, cashing forged checks, and even stealing a car from a rental agency in Daytona Beach, Florida. His use of the uniform highlights one of the key elements of Edwards' criminal methodology, using false identities to gain trust and manipulate his victims. After his arrest in 1951, Edwards was dishonorably discharged from the Marines, sentenced to 2 years in a reformatory, and released in 1954. Upon his release, Edwards returned to his hometown of Akron, Ohio, where he made headlines for discovering a fire at a local hotel and alerting authorities. A fire that was easy for him to detect since he was the one that started it to cover his tracks. Edwards left Akron and continued his life of crime, traveling across the country to cities like Denver, Dallas, and Jacksonville. His ability to slip in and out of towns undetected speaks to his growing confidence in his criminal abilities. In Jacksonville, Edwards landed a job ironically as a private investigator by, of course, lying about his credentials. He then began an affair with an 18-year-old woman, driving her and her child to Akron, where he was promptly arrested. This arrest led to one of his most famous early escapes. While being held in the Akron City Jail in 1955, Edwards spotted an opportunity. After requesting to use a payphone, he slipped past the guards, ran through an empty courtroom, and escaped into the street. By 1956, Edwards had married Janet White, an 18-year-old woman, and the two began traveling across the United States under assumed names. Edwards engaged in a spree of armed robberies, targeting service stations in cities like Seattle, Reno, and Sacramento. His criminal activities escalated in both scale and violence, leading to his arrest in Billings, Montana. Though Edwards confessed to a series of armed robberies, Jeanette was released without charges, and she soon divorced him while pregnant with his child. Edwards was sentenced to 10 years in the Montana State Penitentiary, but was later released after serving just 3 years. His early release allowed him to continue his life of crime with even greater cunning and sophistication. In the same year, he met and married Marlon Hayworth, a 17-year-old Catholic school student who was led to believe Edwards was a government agent working for the CIA. This marriage would mark the beginning of a new phase in his criminal career, one that involved a series of high-profile crimes and increasingly audacious escapes. By 1960, Edwards found himself once again in trouble with the law, this time for calling in false fire alarms, a violation of his probation for previous armed robberies. During his intake at the Portland City Jail, officers noticed that Edwards had a fresh bullet wound in his arm, an injury that would later take on greater significance in light of the Peyton Allen Lover's-Lane murders. Edwards' criminal activities continued throughout the 1960s, during which he evaded capture by assuming various identities and manipulating those around him. He impersonated a Marine, a private investigator, a psychiatrist, and more, each time using his charm and cunning to escape detection. His life on the run made him one of the most elusive criminals of his time, eventually landing him on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list in 1961. Despite being on the run, he continued to flaunt his ill-gotten wealth, purchasing high-end clothes in a pink Cadillac in Atlanta. His flamboyant lifestyle drew the attention of a local informant, which led to his arrest in 1962. Though the evidence linking Edwards to the Peyton Allen double murder was circumstantial, his criminal history and pattern of deception made him a prime suspect in several high-profile cases, including multiple murders. His ability to escape from law enforcement, both physically and through deception, made him a figure of infamy, and his criminal career remains a testament to the lengths a person can go to in order to evade justice. By the late 1960s, Edward Wayne Edwards' life seemed to be heading in a direction few would have predicted. After years of living as a fugitive, escaping prisons and committing a range of crimes, Edwards embarked on what appeared to be an extraordinary transformation, from notorious criminal to reformed man. After his arrest in 1962 and the subsequent prison sentence for armed robbery, Edwards was incarcerated at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas, where his supposed journey toward reform began. During his time in prison, Edwards became influenced by a corrections officer named John E. Alexander, who Edwards later credited with motivating him to change. Edwards took this guidance to heart, joining various prison programs, enrolling in trade courses, and even taking part in the infamous Dale Carnegie program designed to improve public speaking and influence others. His actions in prison were calculated, part of his long-term plan to re-enter society with a convincing facade of rehabilitation. Edwards' calculated embrace of reform worked. In 1967, after serving only part of his sentence, he was granted parole and walked free from prison. Unlike his previous stints behind bars, Edwards did not immediately return to his life of crime upon release. Instead, he sought to reinvent himself as a reformed ex-convict, eager to share his story as a warning to others. He would speak at universities and community centers, telling his story of redemption as a way to advocate for prison reform and crime prevention. In the same year, Edwards met and became engaged to 21-year-old Kay Lynn Headley. Despite his troubled past, Edwards had learned how to charm those around him, and he succeeded in convincing Lynn that he had changed for the better. Edwards disclosed some of his criminal history, but he promised her a new life filled with reform and redemption. The two married in 1968, and it appeared that Edwards had finally settled down into a family life. The public persona Edwards carefully crafted was nothing short of impressive. He quickly became a sought-after speaker, giving lectures about his past and his transformation. Edwards' ability to tell his story with eloquence and conviction gained him national attention. In 1971 alone, he gave over 160 lectures and appeared on numerous television and radio shows. Edwards was even featured on game shows such as What's My Line and To Tell the Truth.
Number one, what is your name, please?
My name is Ed Edwards.
Where his story captivated audiences, his rise to prominence culminated in the publication of his autobiography, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, in 1972. The book chronicled his life up to that point, painting a dramatic portrait of a man who had turned away from crime and embraced redemption. It was marketed as an inspirational story, and Edwards was lauded for his honesty and his efforts to make amends for his past. The book received glowing reviews from critics who praised Edwards for his candor and determination to turn his life around. However, beneath the surface, Edwards' so-called transformation was little more than a facade. Even in his autobiography, there were disturbing hints of his true nature. While much of the book was dedicated to recounting his criminal past and his alleged desire for reform, there were chilling descriptions of violence that stood out to more discerning readers. Edwards recounted without remorse his physical abuse of women, including his ex-wife Jeanette and other girlfriends. In one passage, he described how he knocked her down, kicked her, picked her up, and knocked her back down, revealing a capacity for cruelty that contradicted the image of reform he had been projecting. The cracks in Edwards' story began to show in the late 1970s. After his book was published and his public speaking engagements began to dwindle, Edwards and his family moved frequently, often to isolated areas. Suspicion followed him wherever he went. He had a knack for inserting himself into criminal investigations. His move to Florida in 1977 coincided with another double murder, and by the early 1980s, it became clear that Edwards had never truly abandoned his criminal ways. What the world saw as a story of redemption was, in reality, a performance, one that allowed a serial killer to remain hidden in plain sight for decades. As Edward Wayne Edwards' criminal life evolved, so did the scale and brutality of his crimes. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Edwards' criminal activities had escalated from petty theft and forgery to murder. One of the most notable sets of murders tied to Edwards was the Lover's Lane killings. On November 27, 1960 in Portland, Oregon, two 19-year-olds, Larry Ralph Payton and Beverly Ann Allen, were brutally murdered while parked at a Lover's Lane. Larry was found stabbed to death in his car, while Beverly's body was missing for nearly 2 months before being discovered, strangled and sexually assaulted. The gruesome nature of the murders shocked the Portland community, and the case quickly became one of the city's most notorious cold cases. Edwards had been present at the scene shortly after the murder, which drew the attention of local authorities. He maintained that he was simply a curious bystander, watching as police gathered evidence. However, his presence so close to the crime, combined with his later arrest for calling in false fire alarms, made him a suspect. Adding to the suspicion was the fact that Edwards had a fresh bullet wound in his arm when he was arrested, a wound that would later be linked to a gun discharged in Payton's car. Despite these troubling details, no concrete evidence initially connected Edwards to the murders, and he was able to slip away from authorities once again after orchestrating an escape from Portland City Jail. Though he was never formally charged with the Payton Allen murders, many investigators believed that Edwards was responsible. The similarities between this case and later Lover's Lane murders suggested a pattern. These murders were marked by the targeting of young couples in isolated locations, the use of extreme violence, and the sexual assault of female victims. Edwards had the knowledge, capability, and motive to commit these crimes, but his skill at evading law enforcement kept him out of reach for many years. The 1977 murders of William Lavaco, 21, and Judith Straub, 18, in Doylestown, Ohio, fit a disturbingly similar pattern. The young couple had been shot to death in another Lover's Lane setting, and their bodies were left in a remote area, reminiscent of the earlier Portland case. This double homicide occurred just days after Edwards had given a highly publicized lecture as a motivational speaker, which added an eerie contrast to his public persona of a reformed man. Once again, Edwards managed to avoid suspicion, and the case went cold. Edwards' involvement in these murders didn't come to light until much later, but in the meantime, he continued his violent spree. One of the most definitive pieces of evidence tying him to murder surfaced decades after his crimes.
I really do believe that the two of them would eventually be married, that they would be a couple for life. The door wasn't quite shut, and this wallet was still in the car. From there on, we finally realized Tim and Kelly are gone.
The double murder of Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, both 19 in 1980, near Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, would become the turning point in Edwards' undoing. They were last seen leaving a wedding reception at Concord House, a local dance hall where Edwards worked as a handyman.
One consistent thing that was reported was that there was this dark, dirty van that had been in the parking lot.
The parking lot would have been seen as the perfect location to execute the crime.
There's not a lot of lighting or anything out there. If you were intent on abducting somebody, all you had to do was wait for the right moment.
Their bodies were found 2 months later, brutally murdered and left in a cornfield. Kelly Drew had been sexually assaulted, and both victims had been shot. Over the course of 10 days, multiple pieces of clothing belonging to Kelly are found along the roadway within a 6-mile radius of the Concord house, as well as about a dozen pieces of rope with various knots tied in it. Kelly was found with marks around her neck that showed that she had been strangled. According to investigators, the varied knots found in the ropes demonstrated that it was
somebody that's been in the Navy or the military or in the trades, like a carpenter, maybe a painter.
At the time, no suspects were identified, and the case went cold. However,
in the evening, I received a phone call. It was a female who identifies herself as April. She said, "I think my dad could be responsible for Tim and Kelly. I think he killed them." And she said his name is Edward Wayne Edwards. She tells me about a book that he had written that she said would explain more about her father.
then in 2009, DNA evidence taken from the crime scene, including semen samples, was matched to Edwards.
Both the left and the right leg are completely cut from the ankle all the way up to the waist.
Someone had definitely raped her.
It was a shocking revelation, one that was made even more surprising by the fact that Edwards had spent the intervening decades living under the radar. He had moved his family multiple times, often to remote locations, and continued to present himself as a reformed ex-criminal, despite his violent tendencies. When confronted with the DNA evidence in 2009, Edwards initially denied involvement, but his resistance quickly crumbled. While being interviewed for the murder of Tim and Kelly, he had a broken nose he wrote off as the rifle kicking back and hitting his nose while deer hunting. But deer hunting is in August, not November. During investigations, Edwards' van was found to fit the description of the van seen that night. Faced with the indisputable proof of his guilt, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Hack and Drew. However, Edwards' admission didn't stop there. The theory is Edwards was waiting in the parking lot. Kelly fit the description of his ideal victim. When he approached her, Tem stepped in attempting to defend her and got one good swing in, accounting for the broken nose, but then Ed stabbed him. One of the most disturbing parts of the confession, however, is Edwards trying to convince the police that Kelly consented to being intimate with him.
All right, I had sex with her.
You had sex with the young lady who died?
Yes.
Okay, that explains why. Consensual?
Who, with me? Yes. Oh, yes.
Not forcible, not...
Oh, no. It was consensual.
Even with the crimes laid against him, he seemed appalled by the very idea another time when it was brought up.
Hell no, it wasn't rape. I've never raped anybody.
Well, that's they found semen.
No. First of all, the girl and I, Kelly, we knew each other. Okay, I was doing work up there at the where the dance hall and the bar and everything are at.
Whether in a calculated move or in a moment of true humanity, Edwards can be heard whispering something under his breath in the video.
Damn, I killed her.
In a bizarre twist, he confessed to yet another set of Lover's Lane murders that had occurred in 1977, the William Lavaco and Judith Straub killings in Ohio. This confession was puzzling, as Edwards had not even been a suspect in those murders at the time. He claims that he had confronted William.
Told him on different occasions that if he did not stop making eyes and fooling around with my small children and being around them, that he was going to end up getting hurt. And after about the 4th or 5th time I explained that to him, I told him, I said, I'm going to tell you something, Bill, I'm going to kill you if you do it one more time.
Not only did he accuse William, but also made claims about Judith.
Judith was a prostitute. She'd be out in the car making money with prostitution and stuff like that.
He claims he did not expect her to be with him on the night that he murdered William. He also says with certainty that on the night,
it was dark. She did not recognize me. I know she didn't. And I told her to stay in the car. I wanted to talk to him.
It seems as though there was no intent to harm William at the start, while hoping to conceal his identity. However, the plan was uprooted when
Says, look, Wayne, there's $500 in her purse in the car. If you want money, why don't you just get it? I said, Bill, do you know what you just did? And at that moment, I shot him and killed him. What he just did was tell her who I was.
He then goes on to say he told the panicked Judy to stop and wasn't going to shoot her by the time she came back.
She come back. By the time I had another one I put in, and I shot her, but I didn't threaten her. Tell her I was going to shoot. I didn't even give reasons for him. There was no threats.
His willingness to confess to the Ohio murders was later revealed to be part of a calculated plan. Edwards sought to be convicted in a state with the death penalty, hoping to receive a death sentence for his crimes. Despite his attempt to manipulate the justice system once again, Edwards' plan backfired. Ohio did not have the death penalty at the time of the 1977 murders, meaning Edwards was instead sentenced to life in prison. His final years were marked by further confessions, most notably the murder of Danny Boy Edwards, a young man Edwards had taken in as an adopted son.
So Wayne took Danny into his home and tried to adopt him. And Danny was all for this because Wayne was acting as a father figure to him. And the judge said no.
Though he was adopted, it was only by name.
But we'll compromise and agree to a name change.
But that name change was enough to take Danny in and become the guardian he trusted should take care of him. In 1996, Danny Boy went missing, and his body was found the following year in a shallow grave near the Edwards family home. It was all just another of his devious plots. In an interview with Edwards, it was revealed that it wasn't long after taking him in that he started putting a year-long plan in motion.
With Danny, I saw an opportunity here at long range. It took about a year to set it up, and that's what I did. I set it up to collect the money and ended up getting $250,000 out of it.
Edwards convinced Danny Boy to
have Danny go in as an Edwards to the military and take out the maximum life insurance policy.
It was arranged, it was premeditated, it was thought out, it was planned.
The next step was to get Danny out of the military base. He was set to depart to North Korea, and with Edward knowing this, he capitalized on Danny's fear. At first, Danny was going to ask for medical leave of his own accord, but Edwards convinced him to take a different route. He sent money to Danny to help him go AWOL, since even if he was, the insurance money could still be claimed. When talking about the situation, it's clear that Edwards had a sense of pride in how well he manipulated Danny Boy to do whatever he said.
Did you ask him to do that, or he did it voluntarily?
No, I asked him to, but part of my plan, yes, that started back prior to him going into the military.
Sadly, Danny was unknowingly used to give Edwards an alibi.
Then when he had it memorized and everything, I took him down to Ladue and dropped him off, telephone. I went back home and he called me. It was being recorded. Hi, Pops, how are you? And we talked, and I'm sorry I burglarized the house and things like that. I said, well, I didn't know you were even in here, Danny. And
Edwards admitted to luring Danny to a cemetery and shooting him in the face, motivated by a desire to collect $250,000 in total life insurance. It was between a $50,000 plan he had previously and the one he made Danny take out after joining the military. His callous description of the crime, claiming it didn't weigh on his conscience, revealed the full extent of his sociopathic tendencies.
I think it was the next night that he ended up losing his life up behind the cemetery.
Even in his recount, he distances himself, downplaying his role in the tragedy. Instead of saying he took it, he phrases it as he ended up losing his life. Danny was lured with the promise that someone would have picked him up to help him hide out when he would be clear of any trouble. According to his account, he did all of this right under his wife's nose and told her nothing about it, His manipulative nature is relenting.
I had an attorney representing me, and he got a third of this, so the rest of it we got. And my wife, she was not aware of any of this. I endorsed all the paperwork and forged her name, and she knew absolutely nothing.
As the years went on, Edward's health continued to decline. In 2010, just a year after his arrest, he suffered from multiple illnesses, including diabetes and heart disease. Despite his poor health, investigators still suspected that Edwards was responsible for more murders than he had confessed to. Edward Wayne Edwards' involvement in multiple murders spanned decades, with his ability to evade detection making him one of the most elusive killers of his time. His use of manipulation, deception, and sheer audacity allowed him to continue killing while hiding behind a public persona of reform. In the end, it was DNA evidence and his own confessions that finally brought him to justice. But his crimes left a trail of devastation and unanswered questions. Many believe that Edwards was responsible for more murders than he confessed to, taking several of his darkest secrets to the grave. On April 7, 2011, Edward Wayne Edwards died in prison of natural causes, just a few months before his 78th birthday. He was serving a life sentence for the murders of Hack, Drew, Lavaco, Straub, and his adopted son, Danny Boy Edwards. His death marked the end of a long, violent life that had left a trail of devastation in its wake. But even in death, Edwards' legacy continues to haunt investigators and the families of his victims. His story is one of deception, manipulation, and violence, a chilling reminder of how easily a predator can hide in plain sight.
He would provide me information because he liked to talk to police. Maybe at that time he just wanted to have me as somebody who was in his pocket to help him out if he ever needed it.
In the years since his death, Edwards has become the subject of various true crime documentaries, books, and podcasts, all of which seek to unravel the complex web of lies and crimes he left behind. His ability to maintain a public persona of a reformed man while continuing to commit heinous crimes has fascinated and horrified the public. Edward's story serves as a stark warning of the dangers of sociopathy, manipulation, and unchecked violence. Though he is now gone, the questions surrounding his involvement in other unsolved murders remain, and the full extent of his criminal activities may never be known. There have been suspicions that he may have been the Zodiac Killer. He was an on-the-road truck driver who could have been in California at the time of the Zodiac Killer. And lastly, the Zodiac Killer used 13 symbols to sign off on his letter, and Edward Edwards is 13 letters. His birth name of Charles Murray also had 13 letters. Outside of that, there hasn't been any evidence to directly link him. Edward Wayne Edwards' final confessions, like his life, were a performance, calculated, emotionless, and designed to serve his own purpose. His death may have brought an end to his reign of terror, but his legacy remains a chilling example of how far deception and manipulation can go in masking true evil. Currently, there are no new updates to his criminal investigation. Do you think there is enough evidence to connect him to the Zodiac Killer? What do you think of his claims surrounding his reasons for his crimes? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this one.